Good morning. I'm Kaushal Chari, Dean of UWM's Lubar School of Business. I'm so delighted to welcome you to today's Business Ethics webinar. The Lubar School is very proud to offer this webinar series to the public, sharing the expertise of top academics and executives, and of course, our own outstanding faculty. This webinar is sponsored by the Lubar School's M&I Center for Business Ethics. The M&I Center for Business Ethics supports an educational framework that engages Lubar students in serious thought about issues of ethics and ethical ideas that they can apply as business leaders and professionals. And through public programs like today's webinars, the center seeks to promote business ethics as critical to the success of the market-driven economy. So now I'm so pleased to turn the program over to Dr. Maria Goranova, the Ronald E. Pavasarat Faculty Scholar and Professor of Organizations and Strategic Management at the Lubar School of Business. Dr. Goranova is an expert in corporate governance and will be the moderator of today's webinar. Maria, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dean Chari, and thank you so much for supporting this event, and to the Center for Business Ethics for sponsoring it. Thank you everybody for coming, and huge thanks also to our distinguished panelists. We are very fortunate to have experts from both academia and the business world today with us. So I will introduce the panel in just a second, but before I jump into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the format and why do we think that topic is very important. So we would have in alphabetical order about 10 to 15 minutes for each panelist, at which point we should have about 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. Please ask your questions as the webinar goes. We also have a number of questions that we got from the registration process. We will try to address all of them depending on time at the end. So why do we think that topic is very important? So this is an excerpt from the common sense principle of corporate governance. The diversity along multiple dimensions is critical for a highly functioning board. A common concern is, particularly with the underlying demographical changes in the US, whether the board's executives at the top would be out of touch with key organizational stakeholders. Now, this is from S&P 1500. Larger companies like S&P 500 tend to have more diverse boards. And here you could see it across the country based on the headquarters of the S&P 1500 companies. So not only is the business case kind of pushing in that direction, but large shareholders such as BlackRock, the world's largest shareholders managing more than $10 trillion, they have increasingly published and be vocal about their sets of stewardship expectations. Here you could see that board diversity is one of the top priorities, top 3 priorities with environmental change and understanding of key stakeholders for BlackRock. And BlackRock has certainly worked in that direction. I have a picture from their board back in 2014. Now, yes, this is and was fairly homogeneous industry, but you could see their board, how it looked in 8 short years ago. In 2018, we in academia talk about token directors, boards that have 1 minority or 1 female directors in the 10, 12 people representing the board. And more recently, because of the pandemics, no group photo, but here you could kind of get a sense of the much increased diversity of BlackRock's board. So it's not only that they expect that from their portfolio companies, they themselves have took steps in that direction. Now we know some countries and some states have sought to regulate board diversity. I have here the interest in corporate governance and the declining number of American publicly traded companies. The bars that you see in green, the so-called period of the 4th industrial revolution. So we have a period with unprecedented scope and velocity of change. digital transformation challenges, cybersecurity, big data analytics. So challenges for the board stemming from the level of change, as well as from pressures from hedge fund activists on one hand to have high financial performance and increasing performance to perform well in terms of environmental, social, and governance factors as well. So our distinguished panel has the unenviable task of addressing the challenges and opportunities of corporate board diversity. And I will just briefly go over the panel in alphabetical order. So we have Professor Cynthia. She is a professor at Bentley University and the founding director of Geneen Institute of Corporate Governance. She has published numerous articles in top management journals. Her work has appeared in Wall Street Journal, CNN, Forbes, Reuters. She had done numerous talks for 50-50 Women on Board, Bloomberg, National Association of Corporate Directors, and others. And you could see the books that she has authored, they're very, very relevant to the topic of discussion today, giving voice to values in the boardroom and business and society and the ethical, legal, and digital environment. So thank you so much for joining us today. Our second panelist would be Dr. Stephen Davis. He's the former chairman and CEO of Bob Evans. He was recently named as one of the honorees by NACD directorships, so as recognized as leading director in terms of corporate governance, expertise, and influence. He had also previously received, has been recognized as a pioneer of diversity, and has been named for many years in a row as one of the most powerful Black men in American business. He brings more than 30 years of experience leading iconic consumer brands. And during that period, he has also been a strong advocate for diversity. So we are very fortunate to have him with us today so that he could share his insights. Thank you and welcome. And last but not least, we have Professor Witold Henisz. He is the Deloitte and Touche professor at Wharton Business School, that school that has produced the highest number of billionaires. And he is, as you could see, he is an author of Corporate Diplomacy and a director of the Wharton Political Risk Lab. In addition, he founded at Wharton their ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance Analytics Lab. He has published numerous articles in top international business journals, top management journals, and top sociology journals, and has also very extensive consulting experience as a principal of Prima. They've done consulting for asset managers such as Engine One, multinational companies as Shell, Conference Board, World Bank, IMF, and other organizations. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I will give the room back to our panelists. Thank you all for coming.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me, Maria. I'm very happy to be part of today's conversation. It's a very important conversation, one that I try to engage in as often as I can. And so thank you for the nice introduction. A couple of the things I would like to talk about is where does the pressure come from to increase the number of women and minorities on boards? And I'd like to sort of tee up 4, maybe 5 areas where we see this pressure and we see movement as a result. The first one is the exchanges. As most of you listening today know, NASDAQ has created its own requirement for all listed firms to have 1 woman and 1 person from a minority on their board starting later this year. That's going to be significant because the NASDAQ is $10 trillion in size. There is some suggestion that the New York Stock Exchange will do the same thing, although what they have done under the previous CEO, a woman named Stacey Cunningham, is they've pushed it to their board advisory council, which is a group of CEOs that engage with their own network to identify people from diverse backgrounds that could be good for the board. They have since elected a second woman to head the New York Stock Exchange. Based on my research of S&P 1500 companies, it matters a great deal how many women are in top management and if the woman is on a nominating committee, but it would be significant pressure that the head of the New York Stock Exchange is a woman. History research suggests that that makes a difference in terms of getting women on board. So I don't see any reason why it wouldn't do the same thing. And the New York Stock Exchange is 20 trillion in size. So that the fact that the exchanges, those two largest exchanges globally, are going to have a requirement, I think would be the first point of significance. I do want to mention California, because there are a handful of states that have sort of come at it from a similar vantage point that the stock exchanges do. California, as those of you who are watching this closely, instituted a mandate for all of its companies that were domiciled there. It has since been a couple of weeks ago, I think it was April 1st, it was struck down. However, it has already made a significant change in the board landscape in California, which is an interesting point. The second interesting point is a week later, a group of general counsels at leading companies, former corporate law judges, securities litigators, and leading academics got together on sort of called out by Witold, a pretty well-known securities litigator, that basically said that they're in favor of the NASDAQ requirement, and they're going to back that as leaders in this arena, right? And so they're saying, you know, that the NASDAQ has the right to do this as a private actor. So long story short, it's not going to matter to them that the California mandate was struck down. That sort of leads me into the next mechanism, which is quotas. 10 countries globally have instituted quotas. They have worked to a stronger or lesser degree. I've done some research on this as well. Certainly the ones that have the harder quotas, that have actual penalties attached to them, are stronger versus the softer ones. Strong ones would be delisting or penalties and things like that. So quotas have become an issue, right, globally. And so that sort of ties nicely into the conversation about California in particular. So again, I think the exchanges are really driving this, right, sort of to come full circle on that. The third pressure point comes from, of course, institutional investors who are very active in this space. There was a report a couple of years ago that talked about what we call the big three: BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. They have collectively influenced the board's landscape, according to this one study. During 2017 to 2019, they were associated with an 80% increase in the net flow of female board directors, just due to their pressure. And recently, BlackRock has, in the 2021 proxy season, voted against some 1,100 directors in the Americas alone for insufficient gender diversity. So there's another tactic that is being used effectively. So investors are a really big pressure point. I would also say, lastly, the nominating committees themselves. Again, according to research that I've been involved with, if a woman is the head of the nominating committee, it makes a material difference in going from a token board to a board that has more than one female. It also matters the number of top management team at that firm who are females. And so this was based on the S&P 1500. And also in terms of the nominating committee, as most of you are aware, the nominating committee on boards has to disclose what their practice is, their process for nominating people and then ultimately selecting people for the board. And they have to talk about in their reporting how they took diversity into their nomination and selection. And so what's interesting to me on that front is that if you go into the proxies of firms, which I've spent some time doing, you will see that firms are saying, hey, we don't have a policy, but here's what we do. And I wanted to take a minute to read one that I thought was particularly good. It's from Prudential. And it says in their proxy, Prudential's commitment to inclusion and diversity starts with the board of directors and cascades throughout the organization. When evaluating prospective directors, the board takes a comprehensive view of diversity that includes people of color, women, LGBTQ+, diversity, differently abled, and veterans. And 82% of our independent directors are diverse. So this is a thing, this is sort of a leading practice that you'll see right in the proxy. Lots of them will have nice graphics that will talk about, various elements, but diversity being a highlight. And so I just wanted to tee that up for the audience and for my fellow panelists. I sort of see these four mechanisms, right? Exchanges, investors, quota, and nominating committees as really the engine behind the progress that we've made. That said, there's more progress that needs to be made, as Maria just teed up. So I'll leave my comments there and I anticipate questions and conversation.
Thank you so much for these insightful remarks. Dr. Davis.
Yes, I thought we were going to go with Dr. Henisz, and then I was going to follow up since they've got such great presentation material, and I'll build on some of the things that they talked about. So if he's available, that'd be great. Otherwise, I could go second.
I know, happy to go now, Steven. Thanks. Sorry for the confusion. I put together a few slides just to summarize some of the research in this area, give you a flavor of some academic perspective on corporate board diversity, building on Cynthia's excellent presentation about the 4 factors. I'm going to proceed through a couple different points. First, highlighting the benefits that we see in the academic research to board diversity. What is the payoff? What do we get for it? And where does that show up in terms of measurable performance benefits? Then I want to build on some of the work that I've done with engine number 1 and talk about how shareholder activism is a growing threat to boards that don't maintain diversity, both in terms of gender, ethnic, racial groups, but also industry expertise and expertise on environmental, social, and governance factors. And I'll use the ExxonMobil case as an exemplar there. Then I'll try to talk about what do we know that constitutes good ESG risk management. If we want a board that thinks about diversity, that thinks about ESG issues, what sort of processes they put in place, and we can learn a lot from the enterprise risk management practice. What else can they do beyond the board? It's not enough to have 1, 2, or even 3 board members to promote a diverse organization. There's some learnings there. And then finally, some of the questions that came in, one was very provocative, saying, well, isn't all this talk about diversity just woke capitalism? And I want to push back on that provocatively at the end. So what are the opportunities? What do we see? When we bring diverse board members onto a board, people of different gender diversity, ethnic, racial diversity, those individuals tend to have more advanced degrees. They tend to be more likely to be CEOs, presidents, or partners. They tend to face less dissent in subsequent shareholder elections. They attend more meetings, and they actually increase attendance among the white men on the board. So if there's some sense that we're, giving these slots away, it doesn't seem to be at all backed up by the data. The data is that they're more qualified, they're more engaged, and they're viewed as more responsible by shareholders in subsequent elections. So there's a benefit there in terms of the qualities they're bringing onto the board. Now, what about the impact on the firm? There's been a tremendous amount of academic research trying to see if there's any measurable gain to short-term financial performance. And the answer is honestly not really. But there's also no reduction in short-term financial performance. Now, when you go to the long term and you think about the factors that could affect the long-term performance of the company, the evidence is more positive. Firms with more diverse boards are going to be less likely to face environmental, social, and governance controversies. They're going to have stronger environmental performance, stronger social performance. They're going to invest more in patents and research and development. And for the boards that encompass people who have more awareness of environmental and climate issues, they're going to be emitting less carbon and be further ahead on the climate transition. So there's some real intangible benefits on ESG issues, which are argued to translate into long-term sustainable financial performance. What can we learn from the ExxonMobil case? When engine number one came after ExxonMobil, they got a lot of press as being a climate activist investor, but that really wasn't the story. The story wasn't about making the case that Exxon wasn't preparing for the climate transition. It was the fact that not preparing for the climate transition was destroying shareholder value. But there was a third leg to the triad. It wasn't just they weren't preparing for the climate transition. It wasn't just that they were destroying shareholder value. It was that their board let it happen. And their board was mismanaging ESG risks, particularly because the board was staffed by individuals who had underperformed their sector stock market returns systematically and underperformed the market return during the tenure as CEOs, and they lacked any expertise in the energy sector. You essentially had a set of board members that were poorly performing CEOs without any relevant experience to guide ExxonMobil through the energy transition. Governance was as much a part of the story as climate or financial performance in understanding why ExxonMobil was targeted and why 3 of the 4 board members that engine number one suggested be replaced were voted out, including by BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and other voters. So we should think not only about ethnic and racial experience diversity, but also industry experience and ESG experience. So what does it look like to build up a system to deal with these new risks, the climate, racial justice, other issues in the S factor? We can learn a lot from good enterprise risk management practices. And my colleague, Carolyn Deller at the Wharton School has done some great research showing that firms that have better ERM practices, enterprise risk management practices, do better on these ESG categories, including diversity. So you need to have an organizational purpose and think about how we manage risk in a way to achieve that purpose, not to manage risk by itself. We need to figure out what the risks are we face from diversity, from climate, from other ESG issues, and then model them, their impact on the P&L, then allocate resources to address those risks and opportunities, and essentially rinse and repeat where those systems feed into budgeting, feed into strategy, feed into compensation incentives, and are reported to the board. Good enterprise risk management will translate into good ESG management. What holds us back? Do we have a culture of openness, transparency, and teamwork in the organization? Or does the CEO drive the agenda of the board, not providing them sufficient information or time or voice to guide and give feedback to the firm? Does the board have the relevant expertise? Do they understand and come from a diverse set of backgrounds? Do they understand the industry? Do they understand the technology? Are they being overwhelmed with risks? Dozens or hundreds of risks, or are they really focusing on the most material risks to the organization? And are they working through this process in the real, not in the abstract, with concrete and real definitions for time horizons, risks, and financial impacts, guided by skilled process facilitators, local champions, and working through a process of organizational change? We need to go beyond just thinking about risk management, though. If we're talking about diversity, there's much that has to happen beyond the board. And I just want to showcase a few really path-breaking initiatives by firms that have taken that extra mile beyond thinking about board diversity to diversity across the organization. And also a shout out to my colleague, Stephanie Creary, who's assembled a great set of resources on the website linked at the bottom of the page here. The first thing that we should be trying to do, or one of the things we should be doing as organizations, is making sure that our company and its employees and its management are connected to disadvantaged groups and bringing them into the organization as future employees and future leaders. And a great example of that is the CVS programs that reach out to disadvantaged inner city groups, bringing them into careers as pharmacists, careers as store managers, and really finding a way to do that as early as high school programs and following that throughout every stage of the conversion factor and delivering results there. Making sure that people with diverse backgrounds feel integrated and respected in every aspect of the corporate culture. And I'd encourage you to look at Marriott's Respect for All program there. Overcoming internal divisions to make sure that once we bring employees into the organization, they're well integrated and mentored by people with diverse backgrounds. The IBM Allyship Initiative is a great example there. And then speaking publicly against exclusion. Do we stand up and speak for the importance of voting rights, the importance of every citizen in the country to be able to vote and have voice? Are our executives supporting organizations like Fair Fight or Stand for Democracy? And are they speaking out on issues of great concern, like instances of police brutality? Are they speaking out on Campaign Zero, where academic research has shown 10 factors that can reduce the number of deaths in a community or in a town down to zero against racial minorities? Are they implementing those 10 steps, and are they moving forward in those? So looking for the voice of the CEO and the senior management on speaking out on some of these issues. Finally, and building on the question that came in as to whether all this discussion of diversity is woke, let me appeal to the single largest share owner in almost every publicly traded company in the world, Larry Fink, who this January 18th said quite bluntly, this isn't about politics. This isn't a social or ideological agenda. It is not woke. It is capitalism, driven by mutually beneficial relationships between you, the CEO of a company, or the board of a company, and its employees, customers, suppliers, and the communities on which your company relies on to prosper. Harnessing that set of stakeholder interests is the power of capitalism. And if you don't create value for and are valued by your stakeholders, including those with diverse backgrounds, you won't deliver long-term shareholder value. It is through the effective stakeholder capitalism that capital is efficiently allocated, companies achieve durable profitability, and value is created and sustained over the long term. The other retort I'd give to this is all about woke is the incredibly powerful speech given by State Senator McMorrow from the state of Michigan that has received 10 million views already since it was posted yesterday, when she was speaking out against another state senator who alleged similar claims to her and her agenda, trying to raise awareness and consciousness of diversity. It is a powerful speech, and it's one that many of us could learn from in terms of how we respond to that question. Thanks, and I look forward to the questions and the discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to my co-panelists. The reason I wanted to go third is, number one, I wanted to hear some of the learnings and work that they've done. Being a corporate board director, I'm always in a position to try to, fund, I call it funding my base of knowledge. And I really appreciate some of the things that you shared. And then the second thing I didn't want to do is repeat many of the great things that they've already talked about, but maybe accentuate a couple of the other things. First of all, I do want to shout out to my wife, Linda. I've been blessed as not only a CEO, but also a board director for 16 years. You don't do this without the support of your spouse and also your family. But I also want to give a shout out to my first business advisor back when I was an intern computer programmer, and he was kind of a trailblazer for me. And so the things that he did to help further my career early on really made a difference. And of course, I want to give a big shout out to UWM and the University of Chicago. I do want to start out by talking about a couple of things. Maria had shared a chart, and I want to quote Wayne Gretzky. Wayne Gretzky, they asked him why was he such a great hockey player, and he said, "I always focus on where the puck is headed." A lot of times in kids soccer, you see the bunch ball and you see everybody going after the ball, and there's one smart kid that sees the ball scored out and he scores the goal. They're thinking about where the puck is headed. So I want to tie that to the chart where she showed that 50% of children born in 2020 are people of color. So as we think about where we're trying to take our organizations, we have to be mindful of who are going to be the people running our organizations, who are our customers, who are going to be our investors. You know, I've been blessed to be serving on boards for the last 16 years, and I would venture to say that the last 2 years, the change has been seismic. You know, I've watched this journey, and I would say that diversity is no longer the nice to do, it's a must do. It's how you're going to compete effectively and win in a rapidly changing environment. You know, one of the things that they taught at the University of Chicago and at Wharton and all the other great institutions that have done a lot of research with financial performance, they always talk about diversification of your portfolio. And it's no different with diversifying, your work pool and your board. Diversity equals innovation. That's the best way I can put it. And diversity has to be owned by all levels of the organization. Yes, the board is important in setting the tone, and so is the CEO, but it's senior management, the C-suite, middle levels, entry level, everybody has to be part of this journey. You know, you can't expect the CEO to be like Moses coming down from the mountaintop with the 2 tablets and hoping that everybody's just going to listen to what you have to say. Everybody has to join into this initiative. I want to come back to the point about diversification, because diversification is a way for you to reduce risk. So if you think about your investment portfolio, and if you have a lack of diversification, let's just say that you put most of your net worth in Netflix, and I'm not picking on Netflix. Anybody can have a situation like Netflix. I'm not picking on them. But if you had a lot of your money in Netflix the last week or so, you probably saw a significant reduction in your portfolio valuation. So how do you get around that? You keep a diversified group of stocks to diversify that risk. I want to talk a little bit about my tenure as CEO, because I caught on to the woke comment as well. And I found it almost, I'm not sure what woke means, but I found it a little bit amusing, because when I was a president at Long John Silver's in A&W for Young Brands, and I got a call from Spencer Stewart, and they asked me would I consider interviewing to be the CEO of Bob Evans. And I actually turned him down 3 times. And finally, the 3rd time I asked him, I said, why do you want to recruit me? What's the rationale? And they said, you're the only candidate that has restaurant experience and consumer packaged goods experience. And the reason that was important is Bob Evans was a company that was 70% a restaurant company and 30% a consumer packaged goods company. So it always starts out with the qualifications. Now, obviously, qualifications get you a seat at the table, but you also have to perform. So let's talk about performance. So, and this is not me bragging, this has actually been published, but during my tenure as CEO, and I do want to point out, I became CEO in 2006, and you know what happened in 2008 and 2009. We had the financial crisis. But if you had invested in Bob Evans after the financial crisis, you would have had a 4-fold increase on your investment. And that's because we led with a diverse team. And we performed at or above our peer group level for 8 consecutive years. So I think not only has there been enough empirical studies, but I'm here to tell you as a person of color who has had experience in not only the C-suite, but also as a corporate CEO, that diversification and diversity is not a nice to do, it's a must do. And it's been proven that you can have great performance. This is proxy season, where a lot of companies are, having annual meetings, and people are putting out their ESG statements and reports. They're putting out diversity reports. But I just want to share some of the trends that I'm seeing in some of the reports that are coming out. Number one, you're seeing more companies putting the annual bonus where ESG metrics are incorporated. And 60% of the time in those ESG metrics, there's some metric around diversity or improving diversity. There's more emphasis on culture. I mean, that's business 101. Really having a great culture. There's more emphasis around culture. But within culture is pay equity, employee engagement. Those, what were considered softer skills, are now getting metrics put behind them, because people understand the importance, especially coming out of a global pandemic, how culture and pay equity and how people are going to work in your company in this new environment that we're in. You have to be a lot more flexible. There's also been a lot of discussion around the stakeholder engagement. I want to talk a little bit about employees, and I also want to talk about customers. Customers now and employees both are now asking more, what's in your product? How are you sourcing your product? Where are you sourcing your product from? And how is that impacting the world's natural resources? So if these are questions that your investors are asking, and your customers are asking, and your employees are asking, you have an obligation as a board, as a CEO, and as your C-suite to have those in your strategic plan. And then the final point I'll make is I get a chance to listen to the presentations by several of the boards that I serve. And one of the things that I always emphasize is you're making great progress. It doesn't matter what your starting point is. The most important thing is what is your commitment over the next 5 years? And so one of the things I've been encouraging all organizations to do, because I've spoken on this topic several times, but if this is the last thing I leave you with, you have to put in place a 5-year strategic plan around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because a lot of companies are just now discovering where they stand. So it's nice to have the data. It's nice to put out an annual report. But businesses are expected to put together 5-year strategic plans overall for the business. If you don't do this for diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think you're missing out on an opportunity, and you're also missing out on an opportunity to engage your entire organization in making demonstrable progress in those areas. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Maria so we can open up the panel for questions from the floor and also questions that have been sent to us in advance.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. So I think we could bring now at this point the whole panel. And we have a number of very, very interesting questions. But since you kind of talked about the 5-year strategic plans that publicly traded companies have to now go through, I wanted to ask you, how do you think large private companies would be affected? Do you see maybe some trends between publicly traded companies and private firms affected differently from the different pressures that they face?
The pressure, I'll start out by saying the pressures are the same. I served on the board of Albertsons, and we were privately held until about 2 years ago, and we recently IPO'd. But we function like a publicly traded company. You know, we had all the different committees, but we did the same thing in terms of the 5-year strategic plan, but also we put a strong focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only at the board level, because we knew that coming into a publicly traded environment, we knew what our competitors were doing. We knew what some of the best in class companies were doing. So in our striving to be a publicly traded company, we wanted to be best in class. So we didn't see a difference between us being publicly traded and being privately held. We look more at what are the trends, because we're hiring the same people. We have the same investors that both of our my esteemed panels have mentioned. And you know, in the world of innovation, you know, you have to look everywhere and you have to recruit everywhere. And so it was no different from us. So I would say it was pretty much the same whether we were publicly traded or we were a privately held company. I'll turn it over to my other panelists to weigh in on that topic.
Happy to do it quickly. I think it's great points. I think that there is a difference in private companies in that the shareholder pressure isn't there. And so I think generally we see more variation driven by management and the values of management and also the value of the employee base. So it's possible it could be the same. It's possible it could be more or less. It sort of depends on where the management team wants to drive the company, and are they thinking about themselves as if they were public, which I think is the case that was described. In some cases, they may be more progressive and they may be more out in front of some of these issues. And other issues, they may be more retrograde and they don't face that shareholder pressure. In those cases, it's really up to the employees and the suppliers and the communities to discipline the firm. And that may be more or less effective. So I think on average, we see more variation because we don't see the shareholder pressure.
I would add to those great comments that when you're public as a CEO, your job becomes 3 times as hard. And so that's a big difference. But also, I think it's evidenced by, you know, Elon Musk having sort of a love affair with wanting to go private, right? Both for Tesla and Twitter. And so I think that, you know, there is this sense, you know, as Witold just said, that I'm going to be protected from investor pressure and activism and criticism, so I have a little bit, longer of a leash.
Thank you so much. So second question, what form of diversity do you think is most important in today's business? And how do you think that helps organizations to face some of the contemporary challenges?
I just want to sort of start with that because I've done a lot of research on, what we commonly really call diversity of identity and versus, if you will, but I don't believe in a versus, diversity of thought. Right. So, diversity of identity has become really sort of a observable difference, right? When you see that companies are posting, the faces of people who are on their boards, because we're expected to be able to see it, which is a bit of a red herring, right? Because you can't always see diversity. And so if we have sort of this diversity of identity, how I describe myself, and when we look at companies having board matrices, they're very much in that line of self-identification, which is better than a visual representation. And then the diversity of thought, somebody just talked about the diversity of industry. It was Witold with Exxon, so the diversity of thought, I think those two things can go together, identity and thought, but sometimes, you can have people that look exactly the same, but obviously do not think the same way. They've had different life experiences. They've have differences of geography, of, religion, of all of these other kinds of things. So I would say there's two kinds and you need to think of them as an and, not an or.
The thing I would add to the whole notion of diversity is it has to be intentional. It's not going to happen. Like I said, every CEO that I work with is committed and their C-suite is committed, but it has to continue to cascade throughout the organization. That's why you need to tie it to compensation. That's why you need to have a strategic plan. All the boards that I'm serving on now, we know who the chief diversity officer is, and that person gets time in front of the board. Mm-hmm. Years ago, I can't always say that was the case. Maybe I knew who the chief diversity officer was. Maybe once in a while there was a presentation. And the other thing that I'd like to talk about is, as more companies were trying to I'll call it wrestle down, but they try to unpack ESG. What we all discovered is that every major committee on a board had to own some portion of ESG. So you've got the Nom and Gov committee, you've got the compensation committee. People are establishing talent and culture committees. Audit has oversight over risk. So if you consider this to be, as I mentioned earlier, about reducing risk, audit has a role in this. So interestingly enough, a lot of boards would go from a compensation committee to a compensation, culture, people development. Almost every compensation committee that I'm affiliated with, we've changed the name to be more encompassing of the many aspects, because compensation is an important part of human resources, but it's not the only thing. I would say a lot of times it's the after effect measure of what you've done with a human resources strategy. And the same thing holds true with Nom and Gov. I mean, think about it. When someone mentioned the big three, well, there's also other organizations like Engine One, the Sisters of Mercy. I mean, just go right down the list. The Nom and Gov group no longer is just about nominating and reviewing the performance of the board members, which is important. There's more of an outreach effort that happens not just during proxy season, but year round. And I've also seen us do more open discussions. Like in one board meeting, we did have BlackRock come in and talk to us about their expectation with ESG. So I think it's been very healthy what's happened over the last couple of years in terms of not only the entire board looking at ESG, but unpacking it and saying, what do the committees own and what do they have to do differently? And there's a lot more reporting that's taking place. For example, I'm on Marathon Petroleum's board, and they're about to launch their 5th sustainability report. There are the companies that are doing their first one. So like, again, it doesn't matter what's your starting point. It's where are you today and where are you trying to go? And then also highlighting the challenges that you have to face so that people understand where you are in the journey and what do you have to do to get it done.
A lot of great points, hard to follow. I think the hard to add to them. I think the question about what type of diversity matters, I mean, it depends on who you are and where you are on this journey that Stephen's talking about. You might have a racially or gender diverse board, but be missing the boat on climate. I mean, that was sort of the case for ExxonMobil. Wells Fargo was really great on gender, but was defrauding its customers. So do you have the right mix of expertise for the types of risks that your firm is facing? And if you have a gap in one dimension of diversity, it might show up in terms of your ability to assess and evaluate and mitigate risks that your firm is facing. So more is generally better and more commensurate with the activities you're undertaking.
So just a follow-up question on Dr. Davis' comments on the compensation committee and pay equity. So we all know that CEO compensation relative to worker pay is at all-time high. I think in the 80s, 90s, it was 30-1. Now we're 360-1. It's not uncommon to see companies where the CEO compensation is more than 1,000 to the average employees. Do you think that that would change as the companies and boards are more sensitive to their key stakeholders?
Really interesting to see how it changes as we have more disclosure. In the UK Disclosure Act requiring, it's one thing to look at the CEO versus the average. The UK is now requiring by decile disclosure of wage distribution. We're working with a startup data provider that is scraping jobs boards, LinkedIn, job review boards to be able to do that in the United States as well. So we'll be able to know what the wage distribution is in a firm based on the jobs it's posted, the salaries it's posted, and kind of impute that with data science. And hopefully that'll encourage more firms to publish that whole data. So I think as we have, the research shows that as you disclose more, things that bring shame get brought under control. When we have standards for climate disclosure, the worst emitting firms emit less. I would imagine as we have more disclosure about pay inequality, the most unequal firms will either have to explain and justify, or we'll see more wage compression within the organization.
I think one of the things you'll continue to see, and you talked a little bit about private versus public companies, one of the transitions that I've seen happen is, profit is an important metric, but clearly it's the measure of the other things that you're doing. And so what I'm starting to see more of is maybe, I'll make this up, 75% is financial metrics and 25% are metrics tied to ESG. And, going back to the conversation that we just had, it depends upon where you are in the journey. And also, what are the challenges you face from an ESG perspective? And incenting that, the old line, what gets measured matters. You really have to think about that. And I think that's where a lot of the work has been done in the compensation committees. How do we measure it? Do we have accurate metrics? What are our future goals? Because again, these just can't be, once a year type things. A lot of the compensation metrics have 3-year handles on it, right? So it's like you're looking at performance over a 3-year time frame. Well, obviously that's easier to do with financials. You can do that with a spreadsheet. But if you're talking about climate change, if you're talking about diversity, if you're talking about culture, you have to understand where you are. But more importantly, you got to understand what's going to drive it. It's real easy to put numbers in a spreadsheet. But then at some point in time, you got to say, all right, what's going to be the series of strategies and tactics that we're going to put in place to drive improvements in those metrics? And, the caution to everybody is if you publish it, some people are going to watch you. And then the next year, they're going to ask you about it. And my advice to companies would be, go ahead and put the data. The data is the data. And so if you're falling short, explain why. Maybe it's something unforeseen. Maybe it's something in the environment that you had no control over. But I think the most important thing is to set a goal and have an active dialogue with your employees, with your customers, and also with your shareholders.
Thank you. Another question that we got is that what processes the boards could follow to identify and articulate the type of diversity that would bring value to the organization? Cynthia, maybe we could start with you.
Sure. I just want to follow up real quickly on the compensation, because we've had this movement with Say on Pay, and a lot of it has created higher salaries when you disclose the information. And the interesting thing to me is also the question of peer groups. When boards are setting pay, peer groups can be off, and these, pay consultants have a lot of influence over the pay. And so one of the things that companies are starting to do now is really check closely to the peer group benchmark that they're being compared to when they're trying to set pay. So those are a couple things to watch. So with this question, you're asking what process they should follow in terms of
identifying, potential new members that would amplify board diversity and create value for the organization.
Okay, right, because there are quite a few organizations dedicated to, there's a group dedicated to listing Latinx folks for boards, African Americans for boards. There's a lot of, so there's those kinds of things. There's National Association of Corporate Directors, which Stephen is familiar with. There's Society for Corporate Governance. There's the Boston Club. There's a lot of resources out there that will list people who are qualified for boards. And the interesting thing is that those lists are independent of executive search firms. And that's important because executive search firms have tended to reuse lists over and over. And those lists seems to be generated mostly from former CEOs. If we're only looking for former CEOs, given the fact that 73% of CEOs are white males, we're never going to get diversity from those lists, right? So you must expand your search as a board to find other people with these other sources. And I can create a list if you want me to and send it out, because I really feel passionate about that. We have to look beyond that. Someone who does a lot of research in governance, who is a governance expert, who knows what rules companies have to follow, is a really valuable person on a board. Right. So that's just another skill set that, we look for experts in everything else. I've always been scratching my head why we don't look for governance experts for board spots.
I'll share kind of how I look at, somebody's asking, what models or what things to do. I'll keep it real simple. When I look at our boards, and I look at boards across the country, and then I'll look at their employees on the front line. And my question is there reflection? And there's been some great progress made on boards, absolutely. There's been some great progress made in the C-suite. But what I'm seeing is as you go further into the organization, it's in the middle where we seem to have some opportunities. And I'll give you a case. This is a real case in point. So I was the vice president of restaurant operations for Pizza Hut. And I was in charge of about 600 restaurants. And so we had about 75 leaders who were the first level above a restaurant manager. So when I looked at my restaurant managers, now this is Southern California for the most part. Southern California is about 40% Latinx. When I looked at my manager group, 50% women, 25% African-American, 40% Latinx. The first level above restaurant manager, we had out of 75, we had 3 African-Americans. We had 1 person who was Latino and about 20% female. So I sat down with my leadership team, which is the region level, and asked, why is that? And part of it was that the answer was simple, because one of the teams was in San Diego, another was in Orange County, another was in LA County, another was in Ventura County. And that's close to 20 million people. So what I said was, look, you're not looking at talent across the 20 million. You're looking at the talent that's within the 40 or 50 restaurants that you're in charge of, and you're not looking across the entire region. The other thing is it was called the Area Manager Readiness Inventory, which was an operations test. It was basically operational knowledge of running a restaurant. And so that was a test that everyone had to take. So when I asked the question, do we offer that in English only, or do we have a Spanish version? And you could hear a pin drop. And I said, now I'm new to Southern California, but the statistics I'm reading, 40% of the population is Latinx. And for many of the people, English is a second language. So interestingly enough, when we offered the test in English and Spanish, guess what? The Latinx managers rose to the top in terms of their performance on the test. They had the great performance at the restaurant level. So I made it a requirement that anybody who got interviewed had to be interviewed by the panel of the 8 regional managers so they could see all the talent. It's just not the talent. And that's how we got diversity. And within less than 5 years, 40% of our area managers were Latinx. Almost 50% were female. I mean, it was almost like we opened up the floodgates with just something very simple and basic. And that's what I mean by, you have to look at the frontline employees and say, why aren't they breaking through? Because they're some of your best performers. And if performance really matters, when somebody made the woke comment, I've got a situation where performance was there, but these people weren't getting the opportunity to advance because we didn't think about, oh, should we have multiple language versions? Should we have mentors? We just put in some very simple things. And I'm here to tell you, and I'm not bragging, but in 6 years, we led the nation in sales, in profits, customer metrics, lowest employee turnover, just by opening up the floodgates and letting more people participate in the growth of the company. So I hope that gives an illustration of, yes, you can go outside and look and say, what things should we be looking at? I would say look internally within your organization, start with your frontline employees, and then the emergence of employee resource groups where you have, women group, African-American groups, Latinx, those teams will tell you what you need to do if you're willing to listen and if you're willing to act. And if you have the mindset of, this is what we're hearing and this is what we're going to do, and these are the changes we're going to make, you'll see employee engagement. You'll see numbers like you've never seen before because people want to be heard. They understand that you can't change everything, but they at least want to be heard.
So we have a very interesting question from the audience. So given that we were talking extensively about the importance of ESG factors, environmental, social, and governance factors. So the question is board diversity driving ESG, the company's ESG, or is it the other way around?
That's a really interesting question. I think actually my colleague Stephanie Curry has been thinking about this. The diversity conversation has been around for some time. ESG conversation is a little bit new or a little bit newer. They obviously overlap, but how do they evolve together and how do they reinforce each other? So I think, I think of the ESG conversation as a force multiplier, but it should also learn from and draw from the insights on the longstanding efforts to increase diversity. Not replicate the wheel, not start from scratch. So I think there is a potential for the two to come together and increase the power of change. But there's also potential for each side to feel that they're not acknowledging the other, or they're not understood by the other, and they have their own groups and their own agendas and not working together. And that would be a real shame. So I think the jury's still out on which way that those arrows are going to go and what the impact is going to be, but the potential is there.
I think of ESG almost as an organizational 360 feedback. When you think about when you get 360 feedback, what do? You get your boss to fill out a survey, you get your peers to fill out a survey, and you get the people who work for you to give you feedback on how you're doing, not just financially, but just overall as a leader. And I think that in what I've been watching is, as I've seen our companies put together these ESG reports, it's almost like they've done this incredible organizational reevaluation and self-evaluation. Who are we? What's our mission? Are we living up to it? What are we doing for the environment? What are we doing for diversity? You know, it's really been, to me, it's been a great catharsis, because when you see these reports, they're going to be an interesting collection of who the company is, the culture, where they are in several aspects of ESG, of which diversity is, you know, one of the, like I said early, I think 60% of the metrics for compensation have been tied to diversity with ESG metrics. Well, there's a reason for that. And, you know, some industries have done much better than others. I'll give you a case in point. There was an article that the USA Today did that showed that in 2012, there were 6 African-American CEOs. And today, I believe there's 1. So you ask yourself, how did that happen? You know, at one point in time, we were very proud that around 2012 to 2014, we were one of the industries that had the highest number of African-American and female CEOs. And for some reason, that number has declined. And that's what I mean by a reflection. And that's where the investors, the employees, and I'll go back to the example I gave earlier. There is no shortage of diversity in retail organizations. Go to any restaurant, go to any clothing store, department store, you name it, you will see people of color. Then pull out the annual report. And the companies, to me, should be doing a reflection of, why is that? Or if we're not, you know, if we're being perceived by our investors as not being friendly to the environment, why is that? Just ask the 5 whys. And like I said, this is a great catharsis for the organization. And I've seen some lightning, some light bulbs really go off over the last couple of years. So to me, I'm comfortable with ESG because it is so all-encompassing. And as long as you keep an open mind around your opportunities, and more importantly, what are you going to do about it? To me, that's where companies are really going to drive shareholder value and stakeholder value.
So Maria, I think that the ESG conversation, well, the diversity conversation, I think is really catapulted to the top of the agenda due in large part in the recent years to various social movements. And so I would sort of, give a nod to that, because when I think of ESG, I think in similar terms that Bloomberg does, right? We're evaluated on E, right? E is depletion of the planet's resources, gas emissions, climate change. And S is, how does the company engage with all the stakeholders, principally employees, customers, in addition to shareholders, right? And then the diversity element is squarely there. Treatment of diversity, how do we manage human capital, right? That's in that, including frontline workers and management and boardroom levels all, and tying that to compensation sometimes, right? And then the governance is how does the company govern itself? How engages it with shareholders? What is it doing in terms of refreshment? Diversity comes into play there as well, right? Because refreshment is tied to that, but that the G also, and investors are calling for this more and more, is oversight, monitoring, right? So that's your G, and we can mush them together, but we can also say they are distinct buckets that connect, but can be evaluated somewhat separately.
And just to clarify on that, so we talked about social movements, pressures by shareholders to increase board diversity, responsibility for environmental impact and so on. But at the same time, you also have research on hedge fund activists targeting firms with female, more likely to be targeting firms with female CEOs, more likely to be targeting firms with more diverse boards. how do you think, how do you feel about that? I mean, these competing pressures. On one hand, we have shareholders themselves want more diversity. On the other hand, with hedge fund activism, we see the opposite pressures.
I'll jump in. Well, that's a tough question. So, right, that said, absolutely. One of the things I keep coming back to is I think there's a social justice case for diversity. We can talk about that. It relates to the social movement intro that you just had with this question. But I think what I'm looking to more often now is what we affectionately call the business case. And I think we talked about that at the top, that's sort of the top of the hour. And one of the things that I'm drawn to is the studies that McKinsey's been doing about, and they have this whole series called Delivering Through Diversity. And they've done a number of studies. One was just published in Entrepreneur magazine that boards that are diverse are 43% more likely to achieve above average earnings. They've also done research on diversity of the company and have found, somewhat similar results. And so I think you have to push back on those hedge fund activists. I also think one of the probably your best ways is to engage with some of your big investors, your Vanguard, those kinds of people that are, powerful, but also arguing for the opposite that the hedge fund is pressuring about, right? Because it's sort of a small circle here that they're aware of some of those things. And so you have to make your case.
I think that, hedge funds are a heterogeneous group, right? They differ in their motivation and the way they try to deliver value to their share owners, to the invested partners. The attack on ExxonMobil was saying there's a destruction of long-term shareholder value that isn't being recognized by the market, trying to draw attention to that, bring in new board members, and engine number one profited quite well from that investment. Other hedge funds might shift certain costs onto labor or reduce R&D. And before people really understand the impacts of that, try to cash out, the sort of more short-term oriented hedge funds. One could imagine that some of the attacks on female CEOs, if our arguments are correct here, if those are the firms that are investing for the long term, if those are the firms that are putting the money into R&D, if those are the firms that are investing in the kind of diversity programs that Stephen described, well, the hedge fund might come in and say, well, that's a cost. Let's cut that out. Let's slash and burn a little bit. Let's try to profit from that in the short term, but they're really destroying long-term value. That's, again, one type of strategy that exists within the hedge fund community, but that's not all hedge funds. And I think we're becoming more aware and able to discern the different approaches, and other investors, including institutional investors, are responding differently to some of these campaigns. And so hopefully we'll see more of the engine number ones and less of the attacks on long-term shareholder value creation.
One of the things that I've noticed over the years with shareholder activism is there seems to be a little bit more balance other than just financial engineering. And I don't want to paint a brush on all activists, but during my tenure, and especially in the restaurant industry, if you own real estate, if you have multiple businesses, it was seen as a short-term way. I'll be honest, what was frustrating for me is if you go back and look at my investor presentations, I talked about board diversity. We were a company that got in 2013, the 2020 Women on Boards Award, and we were 30% female. I didn't do it because I was trying to hit a metric. I did it because I was looking for talented people to come and join our board, and I really believed in diversity. Because interestingly enough, our board lacked diversity. Coming in as an African-American CEO, there was also a dearth of diversity of women and minorities throughout my entire organization. But I remember talking to investors about that, and it was almost like turn the page. But I knew that we were working on the right thing long term. So I am glad to see that people are starting to talk about more than just how do you monetize your real estate? What if you break the company up and sell it in pieces? On this whole notion of, oh, well, it's always better to have these businesses focus. I'm glad that we're seeing a lot more breadth in terms of the issues that we're dealing with. And when I look at the sustainability reports for the companies where I serve on their boards, they're turning over every stone and saying, how do we get better? And to me, that's what activists should be thinking about. How do we make the enterprise better for the long term? Not for the next 6 months, 12 months. How about the next 5, 10 years? Because one of the things I noticed is that some activists came into the stock and would talk about shareholder value creation. They'd have been in the stock less than a year and then they're out in less than a year. So I'm glad that we're looking at issues that do have longer tails versus how do I monetize an asset in a company so I can make a fast break and move on to the next conquest.
I'm kind of hesitant whether we should finish on that high note with the long-term implications or whether I could squeeze one more question. We have a number of attendees that were interested in potentially serving on the board. Do you have any advice for them and the processes to get selected to serve on a board? Very quickly, if you could squeeze that in.
Okay, I'll jump in. I'm asked this question a lot. First of all, you need to create a board bio, and that needs to be about 1 page. And so you also just want to say to yourself before you do that, after identifying industries, you really want to ask yourself the question, what value are you adding to this board? What are you bringing to the table? And do your homework and match it to their needs, right? We've talked about that. That's my 2 cents real quick.
Thank you.
If you read most public, these are public companies that I'm describing. If you read the proxy statement, most boards now have a board grid. And if you ever see a gap in that grid and you have that skill set, you should reach out to the board and say, hey, I looked at your proxy statement. I noticed that there's an opportunity there it would tie to. And it goes back to what Cynthia said. What value, when I coach people, it's like, yeah, I know you want to be on a board, but think about it the other way. Why would they select you? And how are you going to create stakeholder value, not just shareholder value, stakeholder value, which is how do you improve the customer experience? How do you improve the employee experience? How do you drive shareholder value? Really think about that and be very targeted versus just being general and say, I want to be on a board.
Nothing to add to those excellent pieces of advice.
Thank you so much for the wonderful, very balanced and very comprehensive discussion. This could be very kind of thorny and polarizing issues. I hope that we addressed the broader scope of the questions that our audience had. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. It was absolute pleasure to talk with all of you, and huge thanks again.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, David. Thanks, Cynthia. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you to both of you. And thank you, Maria and UWM, for putting this together, and Dean Chari.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Dean Chuchari.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Davis, Dr. Clark, Dr. Henisz, and Maria, Dr. Goranova. Thank you all so much. Truly enjoyed this this panel's presentation today. Very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Yes. Bye.
Thank you.